Good afternoon. We are beginning with the third session, which has the name of 4 years of reforms in Ukraine, status of competition on strategic markets. As all of us know, beginning with 2014, Ukraine has implemented several strategic reforms, and the professionals in the competition policy sphere are really interested in the analysis of the following reforms. Reforms of the public procurement system. Well, why? Because this system of the public procurement has a direct influence on the competition state and the direct influence onto the development of the business environment. Another reform which is important and interesting is the reform of the natural gas market, because it implements the pro-competition model of this market, and it also provides the equal rights for all of the players in this market, fair players of course, and it provides the most efficient pricing for this good for the consumers. And also an important reform is the reform in the sphere of transport, and also the new reform of ours in the medical services and so on. As for the reforms in those spheres, we hear lots of positive feedback, but on the other hand, sometimes we hear certain feedback which are a bit more cautious. So we'd like to analyze how these reforms influenced the competition and reform. So we have the question, why the development of competition? Not only because we have the event which is created to discuss competition policy, but because the state of competition directly influences the development of business, the innovations in the business, the productivity of the campaigns, and the competitiveness of the companies. So finally, it very positively influences the development of the economy in the country as a whole. That is why we'd like to look at it through the prism of the competition state. So our expert opinion is that the improvement of the competition state should be the integral foundation of all of the structural reforms which take place in Ukraine. It's really important because sometimes we face facing the politicians and state officials who are not working in the competition sphere, sometimes we hear the thesis that competition is nice, but it's not the first primary necessity for the reforms. In this situation, we always say that competition is not a luxury. And the luxury is not to think about the competition before you implement the structural reforms. At this note, I'd like to introduce our speakers. First of all, I'd like to introduce Mariya Nizhnyk, who is the first deputy of the head of Antimonopoly Committee. Mr. Dirk Buschle, who is the deputy of the director of the energy community from Vienna. Thank you for visiting our event. Ms. Alexa from the Canadian institution. She is the head of the Department of Economic Analysis in the Canadian Antimonopoly Institution. And Chand from the Department of Justice of the USA. Those are the people who are working in the program of technical assistance for the Antimonopoly Committee of Ukraine in Ukraine. And also we are trying to wait for 3 more speakers. The first one is Maxim Nefedov, who is the first deputy of the Ministry of Economic Development and Trade of Ukraine. One more speaker is Mr. Yevdokimov, who is an advisor of the Vice Prime Minister, Mr. Kistion, and Mr. Nemilostivy, who represents the Federation of the Employees of Ukraine. We are waiting that they will join us and our session. As Ms. Buschle has soon to fly away from Kiev, we're offering to give him the first floor. And here I'd like to remind you one piece of news which occurred in August 2017. In the news, we saw the piece of news that the Secretariat of their energy community sent a letter to the government of Ukraine that there is the case opened connected with their obligations, commitment of Ukraine at the natural gas market. So we had a presentation about that. It's interesting why it happened and what's the development of the events in this sphere. So please, Mr. Buschle, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot.
Дуже дякую.
Speaking after lunch is not without challenges. I had an excellent Kiev torta, so I feel completely comfortable up here. As they say in English, and I believe that's untranslatable into Ukrainian, the proof is in the pudding. So when we're talking about desserts, I think this is the reason why you chose this panel and its composition to show whether and to what extent competition is actually a reality when we look at individual sectors. It's one thing to talk about competition policy on a very general level, but if you want to see whether it's actually something that is part of Ukrainian reality, you have to look into the sectors. And I, of course, would also like to thank Mariya and the management, co-management of AMCU. As Energy Community Secretariat, you mentioned it, Sergey, we are enforcers, so we are brothers in arms, also with the competition authority. We are in the second line in Vienna, and we know that being the first line enforcer is always the more difficult and dangerous job. We observe what you're doing from Vienna, and I must say you're doing a great job. Of course, we look at it from the perspective of the energy sector. Whatever I will talk about now is none of your fault. Because you were mentioning a case, an infringement procedures that indeed we had to launch back in August last year. To start with, maybe I still have a bit the impression, and we're talking about energy and competition, it's a bit an exotic topic, because for a long time, as we all know, these two terms didn't really go together well. While it's in Europe and in many places of the world by now, it's an agreed principle that the main governance system, the main set of rules and principles that govern the energy sector should be competition, and that everything else, an intervention by the state in favoring certain players in the market, but also in fixing the structure of the market, must be considered an exemption. And that's essentially the thing that I would like to devote my intervention on. The Ukrainian gas market is, of course, of very special importance, not only here in Ukraine, where traditionally politics, commerce, and the energy system have been very closely interlinked, but also from a European perspective. You all know that Europe is supplied by Russian gas that goes through Ukraine. Ukraine, at the same time, in this status of being a transit country, is in fierce competition with other transit routes. You may have all heard about projects called Nord Stream 2 and others, and has to prove that it is indeed the transit route which offers better conditions, not only in commercial terms, but also in terms of reliability, transparency, and adhering to the rules. And this is essentially also the background of what you have referred to earlier. The Ukrainian government and the parliament, and I believe this is still one of the big milestones of Ukrainian reform policy after the change of system in 2014, in 2015 adopted a law which is a textbook law. It's probably at the time it was one of the most modern pieces of energy legislation, a gas market law, which was not only in line with the European principles, but also had all the elements it takes to create a modern, a robust, and a also protective gas market inside the country. At the time, because obviously the thrust of this law was one towards opening actually foreclosed structures and to bring competition into what hitherto was not even conceived as a market. At the time, it was considered necessary to cushion the impact of that law a little bit by adopting what has been called the PSO Act, resolution by the government of Ukraine, by Cabinet of Ministers, and this established a second regime to protect customers from potential and, as it turned out, actual price increases also on the gas market. The first regime that is installed in order to protect vulnerable customers is, of course, direct subsidies. Vulnerable customers, and they make up the majority of consumers in Ukraine, are entitled to direct subsidies. And on top of this, this PSO Act tried to ensure that also in terms of how the gas is channeled, how the gas is being supplied from its production inside Ukraine through intermediaries to the final customers, and thus trying to make sure that the cheap gas production in Ukraine goes also to the customers inside Ukraine. Now, while we as energy community supported that for an intermediary period, it of course becomes also obvious by only talking about it that this is not, on a long term, reconcilable with the principle of competition. Actually, that was the system before. That was the system even applied before 2014, and I think even long before that. That you would reserve Ukrainian gas to Ukrainian customers as a means of protecting them. And that is not what a market envisages. So we agreed to it because it was provisional. But in the end, what a market, also in the gas sector, as much as in electricity sector, by the way, as well, but also in the gas sector, is to ensure is that new entrants can enter into the market, and that the customers, whether they are on a wholesale or on a retail level, whether they are industrial or household, have a choice. So maybe for the time being it looks like Ukrainian gas, also that has to do with the system of cross-subsidization, that Ukrainian gas is the cheapest, but maybe in the future we get cheaper gas. And you know that Ukraine is already today supplied from Western Europe, where a very liquid market exists, so this is by far not excluded, that exceeding and making it possible for market entrants to use that access also for the benefit of the Ukraine market works for the benefit of Ukrainian customers. So our ambition in the energy community is to prepare the ground to move away from a foreclosed market, both on the wholesale and the retail level, and to create the conditions that when there is more advantageous gas, that is cheaper gas, to a large extent available on the market, when there are market entrants who would be interested to not only discover but to actually act as suppliers, to become active here on this very interesting Ukrainian gas market, then they should not be hindered, and customers should not be hindered by taking advantage of an increased choice through the foreclosing structures that we have inherited from the past. So what the Energy Community Secretariat, as you mentioned, was opposed to and actually reacted to back in August last year, was the trend that instead of defining this so-called PSO Act as a transitional instrument which would take the old structure gas sector to a more open and a more welcoming gas sector, one that enables greater consumer choice as well in the future. It turned out to be a tool which actually is just continuing and perpetuating the foreclosed structure of the market. It sets into stone a supply chain which goes from Ukrgas Vidobovania, national state producer, through NAK Naftogaz, to heat consumers and the obligases, and then to final customers. That is, of course, not a market, and the market cannot come into existence if this is not only a reality, but even protected by law. That's why we said we have to move to a more dynamic, to a more proactive way to open, and we see a great role also, of course, for the AMCU in this respect. The Energy Community, the institution that I'm representing, also made an alternative proposal. It said, let's start with liberalization. Let's take also the gas market law of 2015, the crown jewel of Ukrainian energy reforms, really serious. And let's do that on all levels. Let us identify what we call a gas release program, so that Ukrainian gas is not automatically channeled only in one direction and to Ukrainian suppliers and then also to retail suppliers, which are kind of regional kings, unchallenged kings in their oblasts. But let's give others also a chance to bid for that gas and to provide better conditions for suppliers. This gas release program essentially means that 1/3 of the gas of UGV, so national gas producer in Ukraine, is being made available on a market, and that suppliers can buy it and then can decide on the conditions that they would offer their Ukrainian customers. Also, there was a big problem in the way how support is being provided, support in the form of cheap Ukrainian gas to the heat producers, district heating producers, and also to the oblgases, so the gas suppliers inside the regions, inside the oblasts. Why is that? Because they don't pay their bill. So this monopoly of Naftogaz that we, or let's say a dominant position, it's not a monopoly, I have to use competition terminology here. Even dominant position is probably something that I cannot approve and do not intend to maintain here. But the position of Naftogaz on the market is actually not such a favorable one, because they are not being paid by their customers. And we have received information that in many oblasts, the oblgases even invent something like what is called dead souls. So they have people on their customer list which actually don't exist. They get access to the cheap Ukrainian gas, subsidized also Ukrainian gas, and then they sell it on. But they don't sell it on to those who need it, or not only, they sell it on to industry. And then, of course, make a profit. And we also believe that we have to be very careful in deciding about the margin that we give to these regional suppliers. In the proposal made by the government on a new regime of PSO, they are proposing 10%, a supply margin of 10% to the oblgases, which is of course fantastic. We believe that we must be much more careful, also in the interest of consumer protection, of course. And we do believe that we have to use this transitional tool of a PSO Act, of something which takes us from the inherited, from the legacy situation of a foreclosed gas market with only a few very clearly identified players in the market, to a more welcoming structure for new market entrants, for supplier choice. And in order to do that, we cannot just accept that in the oblast there is always only one supplier, and that is kind of a fact that is being taken for granted. We propose that we also have to start retail market opening, so that you, as consumers of gas, may have a choice, that maybe somebody with smarter ideas, with better prices, comes into the oblasts and can challenge the incumbent. It's never easy to challenge the incumbent, and that's why we have to be proactive here as well. We propose, for example, that the incumbent makes available its consumer database also to potential new entrants, that they establish, maybe that could be a job for the energy regulator, a price calculator, as it is practiced in other countries as well, where every consumer can actually see what's the most favorable conditions that I can get on the market, and that we really make this possibility of changing your supplier, which is something that, for example, in Austria, where we are based, is a reality. You can really change your supplier and you can compare them, and then you have no obstacles in choosing a new one. This is something we want to introduce here as well. And maybe last, but certainly not least, as this current proposal, or the current PSO Act, but also the proposal made by the government, or by the ministry in charge, is infected with competition concerns and also state aid. We very much insist that this organization here plays a role in reviewing that, and also in making sure that what is being paid, advantages, profits that are being foregone, are not excessive. but are really related to what we want to achieve, and that is a protection of customers for a certain period of time, and to the extent actually needed, not to support the monopolies or the incumbents, but to support the customers. That's the vector that we have engaged on. I'm not sure, because the current regime will expire very soon, actually end of the month, after the end of the winter season, whether we will see a new wind of increasing or of an increased market opening in the follow-up regime. I'm pretty sure that there will be a follow-up regime, but between those proposals, so the ones of the government and the one which has been promoted by the energy community, but also by international donors, World Bank and European Union, etc., what we will see in the end, and whether this will be to the benefit of the customers and to the benefit of competition, remains to be seen. Concluding and sitting here, having the honor of sitting here on this stage today, to the left side of Mariya Nizhnyk, I think what is important and to be taken away as well for this audience is we are operating here in a system, in a sector. Proof is in the pudding, remember. In a sector where competition and open markets may not be the rule and the principle yet, but we want to get there. We want to get there step by step, not in a rush, but the vector must be clear. And when we do that, then also the competition authority, AMCU, has to be given a central role in this process, and not only somebody who watches from the sideline and has to nod to whatever political decisions are being taken, but both in terms of competition and state aid enforcement move to the center stage of gas sector development and market opening as well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dirk. I know that you need to...
Я знаю, що вам невдовзі вже треба їхати, тож у мене...
Before you go. So on this case, so the case is open, so the question is more about procedural question. You know, so what does it mean that the case is open about Ukraine? Yeah, because Ukraine is a signatory, is energy community member, so we get benefits, but we also get responsibilities as state, as a member. So could you tell us more about case at energy community? How long does it last for? What kind of consequences it may have for Ukraine in case of unhappy ending? But, well, fingers crossed it will never happen, but we need to understand. And the second question is more on a broader political agenda. So I would like to ask you about your view on a Nord Stream 2. That has been, well, lobbied by Russian Federation. So from perspective of energy community, Nord Stream 2 is a competitive advantage for EU gas market, or it's a tool to increase dominant position of Russian Federation on Ukrainian market of transportation of gas? So 2 questions, please. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. To your first question, what is the impact of this case, and what's in terms of advantages of Ukraine in its energy community membership, and also then possible downsides like being subject to enforcement procedures. I can tell you that in the recently concluded proceedings in Stockholm on the gas supply and transit contracts of Naftogaz with Gazprom, the performance of Ukraine in implementing what we call the third energy package, but also competition rules in the gas sector played a very big role. And that was one of the big arguments as well. And I think a factor which contributed to the success of that case. That indeed, through its energy community membership, but maybe at least as much also due to a credible enforcement system established by us, but also by AMCU, the judges were convinced that Ukraine is actually implementing, or at least seriously working on implementing, the third energy package. And of course, where that doesn't happen, I think putting our heads in the sand is never a good option. So it's better to clarify these issues through procedures, even if they are perceived as controversial or adversarial, and to find out what is actually what's missing, or what's also whoever has the authority to decide upon. This is our ministerial council in this case. Thinks of compliance of this particular scheme with the European rules. We are convinced that currently we are moving away with the current PSO Act and also with the one proposed by the government. We are moving away from the direction of liberalizing the market, and we are pretty confident that if we were to put it to the table of our so-called judges, then we would be confirmed. However, knowing that it's one thing to pursue a case, but it's another thing to try to use the momentum and negotiate. We have been doing this with the Ukrainian government, and we hope, now I just see that time seems to be running out, but I very much hope, also in the interest of European integration and of course also Ukrainian gas customers, that there will be a satisfying outcome of these negotiations and discussions. As regards to your second question, Nord Stream 2 is obviously an alternative route for Russian gas to Europe. And I'm very happy that we have the European Union there and also the European Commission behind us. We have many discussions on this, but we believe that there must be a continuation of transit also through Ukraine. But this is not left to diplomacy alone. Once I made myself very unpopular here in Ukraine by saying I don't believe very much in energy diplomacy. It's one thing to travel from capital to capital and try to pursue people, to convince people that this is a bad pipeline, and we should put we should trust Ukraine. You have to prove that you deserve that trust. I mean, not all of you, but I mean, as if you want to have a credible case that transit through Ukraine can and should continue, the solution to this question lies here in Kiev. We have to really show that by following also among others, the European rules, that indeed we intend to be more transparent, more reliable, etc., than the others. And I think there generally the preconditions are there. This is not entirely related to the internal structure of the Ukrainian gas market. It is more related to something which is called unbundling of Naftogaz, or also the transit and internal transport system operator. To some extent a different story, but also there the same principle apply. In order to make a credible case, you have to be credible by yourself as well.
Thank you very much. Anyone has questions to Dirk while he's here? No, not so far, maybe later. So, yeah. Я зараз перейду на українську мову. Я хочу привітати
Ukrainian. I'd like to greet Mr. Neferdov, the first deputy of the Ministry of Economic Development and Trade of Ukraine. As far as you know, our today's session is devoted to the reforms of the strategic sectors of Ukraine and the competition state. And one of my first questions for your presentation, which you have here, is the question on the system of public procurement. We are really grateful you for this reform. This is a very pro-competition reform. It's really important, but it's interesting to hear about your vision. Which elements of this system in the future must be more perfect to provide the stable level of the development of economic competition in Ukraine? Do you have the developed issues for the further development of this system? And also, this question is for Ms. Nizhnyk from the point of view of the Antimonopoly Committee. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Well, in fact, it's hard for me to say that the reform of public procurement has been finished, completed. We probably just passed only half our way. We have officially approved the roadmap to implement European legislation, so we still have a lot of work to do. Talking about some interim results, we are quite happy as far as the competition is concerned. We can clearly observe increase, just mere numeric increase of number of bidders, and we see enhancement of the quality, where we can see some foreign international companies which are not present at the Ukrainian market correctly. We can see some bidders who are actual producers of the goods and bid for the first time. Now actually the share of private businesses taking part in the bidding process, the share of the companies comparing to European bidding process is 18% more. So we clearly have reached some good progress, but I would not be just satisfied with the situation 100%. We still have issues concerning significant share of the tenders that do not take place. I mean, because of insufficient number of bidders. Maybe that's a problem about the quality of tender documents, maybe tendering boats, performance, etc. There are problems of this kind. We certainly should not be satisfied with average number of bidders. Actually, it averages about 2.5. Sometimes situation is better, but certainly these are not numbers that should make us happy. Yes, they are comparable with the neighboring countries. So it's not like we are worse than Georgian or Belarusians or Moldovians, but we want to be essentially better. So what do we do for that purpose? Well, one of the competition problems is that the tenders are often structured willingly or unwillingly because of some specific considerations without really consulting the market. Sometimes the market players just cannot understand whether they should bid it or not. It's not just about bridging the gaps created by Prozoro system. The point is that we still have to move forward to find solution to very simple issues, like how can we ensure that all schools are duly supplied with the foodstuff, and we need to find solution yet in July or August, but by some reasons these negotiations and contracts are awarded sometimes in January, and before that all that is done in an emergency mode. So we have to do a lot to centralize acquisitions. We've just successfully completed a pilot project, and I'm sure that in the second half of the year we'll start fully fledged centralized acquisition organizations. That looks negatively when we talk about the acquisitions, but this is a way to avoid a faked tender, to really bid for very minor quantities where nobody would just show up as a bidder because it's not an interesting bid. We need to do it wherever it's possible. Here we really rely on our cooperation with the Antimonopoly Committee because indeed there are still many uncertainties in this process. Like if you take medical care, we all understand that acquisitions performed by the international organizations will be transferred to Ministry of Health. So now we will face a number of technical issues. What's the right way to really put it out for bid? Okay, if we suggest that to the open international market, it all will be taken by a single large bidder. So we don't know what to do with the logistic planning of acquisitions. So there are many things where we have to work together. Also, we are very happy with the fact that we can see the implementation for the first time in Ukraine, where the pricing is formula based. It's actually for the first time after the relevant law was approved. Again, it's not about limiting the competition, it's about giving the right form to the competition, where the entities have to compete with prices rather than through the courts and prosecutions. So we have a lot to do in front of us. It's quite interesting work, and in any case it's to the advantage of everybody. That's why Prozor has so many awards, and many countries are interested in our experience. What we can do really good is to lower the barriers for potential participants and opening markets for new bidders, new suppliers. I don't want to really advertise the system. At least it's better than it's used to be before, and the trend is quite positive. And one more point, which is important again for Anti-Monopoly Committee, is the complaint authority. We really have a lot of expectations concerning the draft law to be submitted by the presidential administration. It's about improvement of the procedure of complaints. Some technical matters like sessions in absentia of the complainant, for instance, or facilitated ways to pay for submission through personal room in the internet somewhere. That will remove quite a big number of unjustified complaints, which I believe again will improve the process of the public acquisitions and make them more competitive. Also, I hope soon we'll finalize the process of pre-threshold acquisitions that may be in form of the state-owned online store, or we can use the simplified procedure where the prices are low, like you can buy anything even for a hryvnia. Well, the former version is not that popular in other countries because that requires a lot of financial resources. I just returned from Chile, where 35% of all public acquisitions go through this kind of a store. But that's very robust organization sitting in a big business center. Occupies several floors of it. It's difficult to compare it with our public service. So we should take the form of pre-threshold tenders. That's another way to expand the competitions, because all these direct potential agreements will be directly suggested to the businesses. Thank you. In fact, I would just like to say to add a few words. This, in spite of the workload over there, Anti-Monopoly Committee doubled after all these reforms, but still the committee takes a very positive attitude. It's not only the workload related to complaints, but also to investigative department, which is supposed to investigate any suspicions on cartel agreement or rigging bids. All that has very positive impact over the development of the competition, because now the Anti-Monopoly Committee has more capabilities to detect some anti-competition competitive practices, maybe some preferences for the participants And also now there are better opportunities to detect bid rigging. It's much easier way to do it and to prove it. I would just like to add that any international visits, when we have the guests from abroad, most of them are really impressed with the efforts undertaken by the Antimonopoly Committee. Like we can identify or detect bid rigging just by a single indicator of the submitted information, because sometimes, we tend to think that we are so immature, so young, but indeed we've developed quite a significant experience already. I have another question on this topic, and then we'll move to the next presentation. Let's look at the US experience. They do not have complaint entity at, let's say, Federal Commercial Board. If any bidder has any problems with bidding process, they're supposed to file a case with the court. In the meantime, the relevant commission may initiate investigation before such claim is submitted with the court. The law on public acquisitions in Ukraine expects that the Anti-Monopoly Committee has to work with these complaints and a number of very formal indicators, but also this committee is expected to ensure certain level of competition. So I know how everything about your workload. Do you have enough resources in order to really check the impact over the composition of every case you deal with? Or maybe you should prefer really some selected typical cases, and then you would apply sanctions. Well, let me first talk about the policy. And Mariya then maybe will talk more about practices. First of all, we all understand we are moving towards Europe, so we are trying to harmonize our policies with European practice. Yes, many countries have this complaint authority, but some do not. Then I would step back and say that, you see, the whole tender process is not just a universal remedy, just a ritual to follow to make it correct. That's a tool, a mechanism to ensure, in average, I emphasize in average, better results than without such tool. I always say that had we had super professional buyers, we wouldn't have needed any tenders, because in this case the tenders make the situation even worse. Imagine that all of them are Mahatma Gandhi, and they are absolutely crystally honest, and they just decide what would be the right terms of an acquisition, what negotiations have to be conducted to obtain the best conditions, etc. The tenders would not have been needed. But unfortunately, as in any other country, whatever professional the acquisition specialists are, still the safeguards are needed in the form of these tenders. Also, different countries have different number of key spending units or customers. Like Chile has only 150 public customers, while if you look at Kiev, just Kiev city administration, it's more than 1,000. They do not practice this municipal enterprises or these structures for acquisition at the level of a village council. So if we have a strong regulator which has a strong reputation and enjoys respect and trust, and if we have professional acquisition personnel, because I hope we will switch to professionalization, which will include accreditation of the acquisition personnel, then well, so when I asked them how that works in Chile, they have a regulator, so-called Chile Compra, something similar to our Prozorro. When we see a problem, we write an email to the customer or we call them, and in 99% they say, yeah, I was wrong here. What about Ukrainian acquisition specialist? Today we talked to the authorized representative of Ukrainian government. When tender starts, they file a complaint with the Antimonopoly committee. Then they submit absolutely similar bid, and the bidding board has to close the first bidding process. There are a lot of then aggressive claims, and many other bidders decide not to continue this practice, understanding that they will just spend 5,000 hryvnias, and that same company will complain and complain again. Then they reach the point when, say, school doesn't have food stuff to cook for their pupils or children. So at the last point, they conclude the contract. So, under circumstances of this kind, and without these opportunities to apply formal complaint, probably we will not be able to really regulate it properly. Of course, this complaint authority decision should be challengeable in the courts, but so far we still need this kind of authority. Later in the future, yes, we will certainly have to streamline this process. We understand that customers, the buyers, at the public acquisitions, they are not professional people, and when the situation is corrected, then probably the legislators will decide to choose this situation, because the number of problematic bids will become so low that it will be able to be solved through the courts. Yes, I agree, resources are not sufficient, and still I'm sure we need this complaint authority in view of all these experiences and violations that have taken place, and in spite of all these negative lessons learned with this complaint authority. Talking about bid rigging, that's a separate function of the Anti-Monopoly Committee. Here I would disagree with the evaluation of its impact over the competition. Actually, here we are not supposed to prove, to demonstrate the negative impact over the competition, but often when we decide whether we should initiate the case, we are trying to foresee the outcome of this case and compare it to the resources available to us. Well, of course, if you open a Facebook, all civil solvents receive their very negative comments, so I'm one of them. But we conducted a number of polls for participants of the bidders, and the result was that Anti-Monopoly Committee enjoys the highest level of trust comparing to all other stakeholders involved, public stakeholders involved in the bidding process, because the people can say that yes, they may expect a fair result if they apply to the Anti-Monopoly Committee, and I think for any public authority that's a very positive result. One more point to specify. Yes, the law on public acquisitions allows you for involving experts, field experts, narrow specialists, in order to find the right solution. How often do you use this opportunity to analyze compliance? See, as a rule, the parties are interested in demonstrating that their rights have not been violated, and then they invite these experts who are trying to really persuade the members of the Antimonopoly Committee of improper, say, technical practices. And how do you assess the qualification of these subject matter experts? Yes, they submit certain documents confirming their qualification. No, we do not have any lists of specific institutions that they are supposed to be graduated from. No, we just need just formal confirmation of their qualification. Now I suggest offering the floor to the next speaker, who will talk about the market of natural gas and energy. I hope this remote control is operational. Well, since the topic of the third panel is about the most interesting or strategic economic sectors, I'd like to concentrate the sector of economy in my presentation, because in fact more than 10% of GDP, 2 years ago they were 30% of GDP, fall onto the energy sector. In addition, the energy sector is the biggest taxpayer in Ukraine. Their share of taxes is more than 25%. In addition, as it has been stated before, probably the energy sector is where the biggest reforms are taking place, because we had specific model at the gas market and the electricity market. This model was absolutely anti-competitive, and now we are switching to absolutely competitive model. What's happening? Ukraine has joined energy community yet in 2011 and undertook certain obligations, in particular with regard to implementation of the third energy package. But in fact, this implementation provides for creation of competitive relations at the gas and electricity markets. During that time, the law on state aid of Ukraine was adopted, the law on the natural gas market was adopted, the law on regulators, and the law on the electricity market. Has these markets become competitive? Let me start with the natural gas market, because already many things have been said with this regard. But that law was adopted, and then after its entry into effect, the actual player at this market was Naftogaz of Ukraine. After liberalization of this market, the number of players increased. We are talking about now wholesale market, in particular 2016 we had 28 importers, then even more, and as of today the import of the natural gas is more than 40% of the whole imports of Ukraine. Still, we're facing the problems that have been mentioned and impact the development of the competition. That's the combination of the functions of the special supplier function and activities trading on the wholesale market. The residential consumers cannot change their suppliers. There are still natural monopolies on that market. There are no criteria for selection of the supplier, and plus there is uncertainty with pricing of the natural gas. When we talk about the electricity market, over there the reforms have just started. It's evident that the single buyer model is obsolete and anti-competitive, but in fact, the adoption of a new law as such will not create a competitive market. We recognize that now we are in transition period when we have to pass the secondary legislation providing for competitive rules of the game. Plus, we need to analyze all those preconditions that prevent us from creation of competitive market of electricity. The main preconditions and barriers for creation of competitive environment were identified by Antimonopoly Committee in 2016 in their report. Some of these recommendations have already been fulfilled, but still there are problems of cross-subsidizing, a problem on absence of market of the coal, lack of regulation of the imports, and significant level of debts and insufficient regulation of natural monopolies. The new model of the market, the new model is oriented towards development of the competition. It's the 100% state regulation would remain only for natural monopolies. What does this new model provide for? That's a free choice of suppliers of electricity, the autonomy of the enterprises in their decisions how much of the product they would trade. That's about use of stock exchange indicators and other principles of honest and fair competition, which actually are part of the agreement with the energy community. Some reforms and some steps have already been implemented. But of course, the full change of this paradigm will probably take place only in 2019, when the law on electricity will come into full effect. By that time, we need to develop a big number of secondary regulation acts, because they will define the rules for the key players. That's why the Anti-Monopoly Committee, in understanding this need, and in addition we have relevant provisions on the law on electric energy, reading that any rules regulating this market are developed by the regulator and are supposed to be approved by the Anti-Monopoly Committee. They participate in development of this anti-monopoly legislation. And actually, as you can see on that slide, these regulatory acts some of them have been developed, and actually the regulator accepted the drafts. The relevant parliamentary committee, the Anti-Monopoly Committee provided our comments, and then we'll have the final version of these acts approved by both parties. But the first comments that dealt with the secondary legislation, as we believe still may have some negative impact over the competition, are described here by the slide in more detail.
I mean, both the delegation of the authorities of the regulators for the monitoring of the market for the participants of the market, which could give the certain privileges for the certain participants of the market, and this is the size of the financial guarantees, which can become an obstacle for the participants in the market and increase the level of prices for the electrical energy. Those are certain uncommon authorities for the separate participants of the markets, the lack of the responsibility for the confidential information, and also the inconsistency between the regulations which have been adopted by the regulator. But we do not exclude that all those remarks have been taken into consideration by the regulator during the final processing of the secondary legislation, and now we are waiting to get them and to look whether they were taken into account or not. Besides those ambitious obligations and commitments Ukraine took as for the liberalization of the natural gas market and electrical energy, Ukraine took ambitious obligations as for the use of the system. of the state assistance and aid, and now the Anti-Monopoly Committee has already used the law since the summer of 2017. Besides, there was developed several acts as for the criterion of the criteria of several forms of state aid for the competition. For instance, the form of the state aid and state support of the small and medium enterprises, the state aid for different scientific research, state aid as for the support of the ability of paying ability and the prevention of the bankruptcy of the companies and others. And as for the energy market, we are developing the criteria of accessibility to protect the environment and in the coal branch. So we offer everyone to be involved in the development of those acts. Besides, what's also important as for the energy markets and the market of electrical energy and gas market is that by the Article 3 of the law about the state aid, we can precisely see that the action of the law is not connected with the services for the economic interest as for the compensation of the expenses for the next services. The list of those services which has the economic interest is defined by the Cabinet of Ministers. And the Anti-Monopoly Committee, together with the Ministry of Energy and the Cabinet of Ministers and the Ministry of Fuel and Energy, are working upon this list. Besides, for the subject, in fact, to be the subject which provides the services of the economic interest, and for it not to be subordinate to the law on the state aid, we're using the European regulations which were posted by the so-called Altmar case, that the subject must have certain obligations on the services provided to the population, and these obligations have to be precisely defined. And secondly, the parameters to calculate the compensation have to be objective, transparent, and defined beforehand. Thirdly, this compensation cannot exceed the expenses, but it is foreseen that the subject can get some of the reasonable profit for his or her activities. And fourth, if the enterprise which provides the services for the population was not elected in the competitive and transparent way, the level of the necessary compensation for this subject has to be defined, knowing the analysis of the expense. And the last thing I'd like to mention is that, taking into account that even the market, natural gas market and electrical energy market, and especially the latter, are still really concentrated with the limited circle of players. So the obstacles and the barriers of getting into the market are still very high. When we are getting to the market relationship, when we limit and restrict the participants of the regulator in the regulation of the volumes and of the price, taking into account the structure of the market, it really creates the preconditions for the potential anti-competition practices from such subjects. That is why, in our opinion, in those spheres it's really important to cooperate between the Anti-Monopoly Committee and the regulator in the sphere of economy and the Commission, and in this sphere we can use the experience which is already existing in the European Union and other European countries, including the rules which are in fact foreseen by the regulations of the EU as for the integrity and transparency of the energy market, which foresees the ban for the insider trade, which foresees the efficient monitoring from the regulator for the Anti-Monopoly Committee to have an opportunity to use the legislation as for the protection of the economic competition, which foresee, in fact, that the national regulator and national anti-monopoly authorities have to cooperate to provide the transparent, honest, competitive rules of games at this market. Thank you. Thank you so much for such a full of sense presentation. And now we are speaking English from now on.
Now we'll switch to English. Yeah, and we have two very interesting presentations from US and from Canada. They are quite similar in the way they will outline advocacy principles, but they will focus on different sectors. So we have Chan and we have Alexa. Chan will focus on electricity market in US, and Alexa will focus on telecoms market in US. So, and they both will talk about advocacy activities when competition authority advocate the competition principles before regulators. And Alexa will give very interesting introduction about quantitative approach. So how do you use economic analysis to advocate for a better change, for a pro-competitive change? So I would like to invite Chan to take the floor, and there you go, your microphone.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here this afternoon. You're all here still. That's great. I want to start off. I'm an attorney at the U.S. Department of Justice, but I want to thank the AMCU and USAID because I'm here as part of a USAID-funded project to provide technical assistance to the AMCU. And they put up the English version of my slides. It says the 8th International Competition Policy Forum. So I'm a year early and we're running late, so I'm going to do my best to be as brief as possible. Yes, no, I know that. The Ukrainian version said 7th. So before I get started, I need to give the disclaimer that the views expressed today are my own and not those of the U.S. Department of Justice. I want to cover a few quick basics. Both the Department of Justice and the U.S. Federal Trade Commission have antitrust jurisdiction, but they don't review the same transaction or conduct. There are also state and federal regulators in electricity markets in the United States with different standards. And although today I'm going to talk about electricity, there are two broader takeaways that apply to competition law in general. First, sound economic analysis is important in antitrust. Second, competition advocacy by antitrust agencies can help regulators form good regulatory policy. And on my slides, which will be posted on the website, I have a number of slides. I'm not going to get through them all in detail, but they talk about a merger, the Justice Department challenge, a Justice Department investigation into exclusionary conduct, and competition advocacy by the staff of the Federal Trade Commission before the United States Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. In the slides at the end also have some links to some resources which I hope will be maybe helpful to you in the future. And it's my hope that by sharing some experience is in the United States, that those experiences will be helpful to Ukraine as it moves towards liberalizing its electricity industry as well as to competition law more generally. And before I get there, I just want to briefly discuss the U.S. analytical framework and how we apply it to electricity markets. So the horizontal merger guidelines they set forth the basic framework for how the U.S. antitrust agencies do their analysis. Well, we're in Ukraine, so you might be wondering why this matters. Well, the AMCU has recently adopted similar merger guidelines. So I want to talk about market definition and how we think about product markets and geographic markets in electricity markets. And I'm going to focus on wholesale electricity today. Wholesale electricity today, demand in the short run is highly inelastic, so customers would not reduce their use or switch to other products in sufficient quantity to make a price increase by a hypothetical monopolist unprofitable. And now I'll try and put it in simple terms. That means that if the price of wholesale electricity goes up in the near term, consumers will still use about the same amount. And for geographic market, we look at transmission constraints. And I want to focus today on the high voltage system where electricity flows. That's the lines that carry electricity from point A to point B. So, for example, from your big nuclear plants to the Ukrainians in the large cities. And a transmission line becomes constrained when it reaches the limit of electricity that it can carry. In simple terms, you can think of this as a hose or a pipe being full of water. It's full and it can't carry any more water. And we focus on economically significant constraints. That is, lines that are constrained for many hours and affect a large volume of commerce. And during the hours that the line is constrained, the line is full, and local generation inside the constraint must be called to meet demand, and thus a hypothetical monopolist of all the generation inside the constraint could profitably increase price by a small but significant amount. In other words, you need to use local generation plants to make sure that the lights stay on. Just briefly, in mergers in electricity, as well as generally, we think about two types of competitive effects: unilateral effects and coordinated effects. And in electricity markets, it's important to note, as you move towards liberalizing the sector, that unilateral market power can be exercised with small market shares, assuming that you have the right set of assets. All right. Please stay with me here. I'm going to try and make this as simple as possible. So the diagram here illustrates how to analyze if a firm has the incentive and ability to withhold some of its output from the market, thereby raising prices to consumers. We have a supply curve and a demand curve, and the intersection of those curves determines the market price. And let's call that initial price without any withholding, that is in a competitive market, P0. All companies offer all of their output into the market. And let's suppose that different types of technologies have different costs, like hydro, nuclear, and coal, which are represented by the various steps in the supply curve. And let's assume that we have two firms in this market. The first firm, Firm X, owns unit G1, and Firm Y owns the other 3 units. And if you look here, without any withholding and without any exercise of market power, units G1, G2, and G3 are needed to meet demand. And thus G3 is the marginal unit and sets the price. Unit G4 is more expensive, and it isn't producing because it has costs that are higher than the market price. And units G1 and G2 are what we call inframarginal. That is, they're not the marginal unit that sets price, and they're selling their output into the market. So Firm Y, the firm that owns the 3 units, is considering whether or not it can unilaterally withhold output from the market to raise the price of electricity to consumers and make more money for itself. And Firm Y owns this unit, G3, and it has it has costs that are close to the market clearing price, which means it's a good ability asset. It doesn't cost a lot of money to withhold this unit from the market because it's not making a lot of money by running because it has high costs. withholding that unit costs some money. It doesn't cost as much money as withholding G2. And that's because G2 is cheaper to run than unit G3. So the basic analysis, what we do here is we take a look and say, what happens if you withhold this unit G3? Let's just say it's not available to run, or maybe you decide to price it much, much higher. The lost profits are represented by the square B, and the increased profits are represented by the rectangle A. And so what happens is if you withhold unit G3, you lose what's in area B, but you now make a higher cost unit set the price for the market. And so the firm the firm that owns the 3 units makes more money on unit G2, what we call its incentive asset, because it gets a higher price on that output. And the basic analysis, what we do when we try and analyze whether or not someone has a unilateral incentive to withhold, is to compare area A to area B. So with that, I'm going to move on to a concrete example. Very quickly, go through an enforcement action in an electricity merger, and this is what is called a concentration in Ukraine. I'm going to provide a high-level view, but there are cites to 3 articles at the end of this presentation by PhD economists that discuss different approaches to economic analysis of a merger or concentration. And in this electricity merger enforcement action, we identified 2 areas of the country where the concentration would have a significant impact. And in those areas, transmission lines were constrained a substantial number of hours of the year, limiting purchasers from turning to generation from outside of those areas in the event of a price increase. And the focus of our concentration challenge was whether combining Exelon, which had a lot of nuclear baseload incentive assets, with PSEG, which had a lot of ability assets, coal assets, would likely harm consumers. And, DOJ ended up settling the case by requiring the firms to sell 6 ability assets, and that by taking those assets that reduce the ability of the merged Exelon and PSAG to raise the price of electricity to consumers. Ultimately, the deal was abandoned because the firms could not get approval from a state regulator. All right. So I want to turn now and just briefly discuss a DOJ investigation into exclusionary conduct in the electricity industry. And the issue there was whether a firm called Entergy was excluding its rivals or competitors. And I think that this is an important thing to think about when you write the rules and you restructure and liberalize the electricity industry, who has control over the grid and who has access. So Entergy was a vertically integrated utility that owned generation and transmission, and importantly, it controlled the dispatch of the transmission grid in its service area. And the Antitrust Division investigated whether its conduct was exclusionary under our our law prohibiting monopolies or attempts to monopolize. And specifically, what we investigated was whether or not the control over the transmission system, combined with its dominant fleet of gas-fired power plants, was used to exclude lower-cost competitors from selling electricity on a long-term basis into the market. And we evaluated whether the practices, the exclusionary practices, foreclosed competitors' access to a key input into long-term power. And during the course of the investigation, Entergy announced it intended to join what's called an organized market. And that is a market where everyone can bid into the market on an equal basis, and someone else decides who's going to get access to transmission. And it also agreed to divest its transmission system. And in a press release, DOJ said that the commitments were significant steps toward restoring competition and will directly benefit consumers. And I have one more slide, and I'll be very, very brief here. I just want to mention competition advocacy is an important part of what the antitrust agencies in the United States do to help regulators form good policy. And this is one example of an FTC staff comment to the United States Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And a link to the full comment is in the resource section of these slides. And there's also a link in the resource section to a joint DOJ and FTC comment to the FERC about how we recommend that they analyze market power in electricity markets.
Thank you very much, Sean. Thank you. And now I would like to welcome Alexa O'Donnell from Canada, as I said, the head of the Economic Analysis Directorate from Canadian agency. So please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me with this microphone?
Did you switch it on? Is it on? Hello? Yes, it's on. Just close it.
Great. So thank you, everybody. I have the unenviable position of being between you and your coffee break. So let me try and go quickly so you can get to your caffeine. I'm going to talk to you today about advocacy as well, but specifically I want to talk to you about the importance of quantitative evidence when you're doing advocacy work. So standard disclaimer as well, my views today will be my own. So this is just a little bit of background about the Competition Bureau. We're also an independent enforcement agency. We have about 350 people, $46.5 million budget Canadian, and by our own estimates, we save the Canadian economy $2.7 billion every year. So let's really talk about how you go about doing competition advocacy. First and foremost, I think as many of you know, it is incredibly important that competition agencies have a strong voice in the regulatory process. But more than that, you can really deepen that impact when you also include quantitative evidence in the advocacy context. And as agencies, we can really use our advice to help strengthen regulatory institutions by ensuring that the rules that they put in place have a sound economic foundation. But we all know that we have resource constraints and time constraints and short deadlines, and so often we revert to what I'll call here a principle-based advocacy. And that's using things like saying, you know, competition leads to lower prices, it leads to greater consumer choice, and it leads to increased levels of innovation. Those things are all true, those things are all based in sound economic principles. But they can seem a bit abstract to people who are outside the economic and regulatory context. And so to make that message more attractive and more understandable, whether it be to politicians or to other regulatory agencies, we don't want to just talk about the fact that prices will be lower in the abstract. We want to talk about what that really means for consumers. And so to illustrate that point, I'll be talking through an example of an intervention we made in front of our telecommunications regulator. So this is just a bit of context. So in Canada, we have 3 carriers there, and our media has nicknamed them the Big Three. That's Rogers, Bell, and Telus that you see right here. And historically, they've served about 90% of consumers. So that's huge. They have a large market share. And these firms are regulated at a federal level by a group called the Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Committee. So that's CRTC. That's our telecoms regulator. They are separate from the Competition Bureau. And they tend to make their decisions typically by way of public consultation. And during these consultations, people can write in or make oral statements, and then the CRTC, the telecom regulator, they will make their decision in the public interest and according to their mandate. And the Commissioner of Competition, so the group that I work with, we have a legislative authority to be able to participate in these matters. That's the door that gets us to the table so we can talk to them. And given how important telecommunications are in the modern age, I think as you can see, phones are very important to us. We participate quite significantly in these regulatory proceedings. In the last 5 years, I think we've made something like 22 submissions to the CRTC over a number of consultations. And the one I'll talk about occurred in 2014, but really the story starts in 2005. At that time, telecom was growing. We all wanted our cell phones. Data was starting to become important. And given the growth of telecom services, the Canadian government tasked a panel to look at modernizing Canada's telecommunication policy framework. And honestly, the results were a bit abysmal. Citing some OECD reports, they said that Canada ranked last in terms of OECD countries in terms of wireless penetration, and that our prices were really quite high. And so the Telecommunication Review Panel, that was the group that was looking at this, they said that Canadians were effectively only being served by these 3 players, the Big Three that I was mentioning before. And a popular opinion was, is it because there's a lack of competition among these 3 firms that we're seeing above average prices compared to other jurisdictions? So following this report, the Canadian government thought to itself, we need to take action on this, and we need more entry into the market. So in 2007, there was a spectrum auction, and the government said, we are going to reserve some of that spectrum for new entrants. And these 3 that you see here were some of the companies that purchased some of that spectrum and ultimately entered the market. So you'll see them, they're on the East Coast, the West Coast, the middle of the country, and that was great. But just giving spectrum to new entrants, that doesn't make them effective competitors. And just to give you a sense, I think it's important to say the Canadian telecommunications market, it's got some interesting features, and it's quite a difficult market. So I hope you can see this, but we've tried to overlay the Canadian map with Europe. Canada is huge, geographically speaking. It is massive. But we really don't have that big of a population. We're only about 36 million people over that huge space. And just to give you some context of what that means, there's about 4 people per square kilometer in Canada overall. Ukraine, here you have 74 people per square kilometers. France has 118. Germany has 232. So huge space, small population. What does that mean? It means if you're a telecommunication provider, you need to build expensive towers over a vast, expansive space, but you don't have that many consumers actually paying to use your service. But as someone who lives in Canada, I still want to be able to travel around the country and get service wherever I go. So it is a really tough economic proposition. And so a battleground, if I can call it that, became what we call roaming access. So new entrant firms didn't have the ability to build out an entire set of networks, and they wanted to roam, they wanted to use the existing networks to provide their own services. Obviously, they would pay the people who own them, but they still needed their permission to do so. And this is really, the context of where this story takes place. So I hope this is clear, but what I have here is just an example. So Ottawa, Montreal, and Toronto, those are 3 major Canadian cities. And this is an example of a network of Videotron. That was one of the new entrants. And it has service in the orange areas. That's where it has built its network. But Toronto is a major economic hub, so you can't have a network that doesn't include Toronto. And so it needs that orange section, which belongs to someone else, to be a viable player. Otherwise, I as a consumer wouldn't want to purchase their services if I couldn't get access across major important parts of the country. But as you can understand, the people who own the networks, who paid a lot of money to build them out, they're not very happy about this idea of having other people use their services. So in 2014, the telecommunication regulator, the CRTC, they launched a consultation, and among other things, they wanted to know, should entrants be allowed roaming access? It was a huge issue for the future. So as you can understand, if they sided with the entrants and they got it wrong, then economic efficiency suffers because you have these incumbents inefficiently providing roaming access to their rivals, and they have no more incentive to make your network good and upgraded. But if they sided with the incumbents and they got it wrong, then we as consumers wouldn't have the benefit of competition, and we'd have these high prices still. So that really gave the Bureau a unique position to undertake an impartial economic analysis that would be a key input into this proceeding. So there's a couple of things to mention here. First is that we made this a priority, and that means that we invested. We had one of our senior economists work on this project for a number of months, and we also hired an external economic expert who was there to help us with the analysis, lend credibility to the analysis, and also be a speaker in front of the telecommunications regulator with us. And our goal was to do this independent assessment, and we relied on public data to do so. And as you can see here, what we ended up finding was that if there is an effective fourth player, Canada gains $1 billion of consumer surplus per year. That's huge. And a lot of that is associated with that 2% decrease in prices that you see, so that would affect everybody. But also, there would be more users. You would see penetration would increase by 4%. And what happened? So the CRTC got that information from us, and they actually did decide to impose mandatory roaming as a condition on our wireless incumbents. So that was a really great win for us. The specific details of how it's being implemented, obviously that's not as easy, so it's still being worked out. So we don't have the full picture of the result yet, but what we do know is we recently had an enforcement case, a merger in the wireless industry, and our own results were showing that in places in Canada where there was a strong fourth player, the prices were lower. So what we were doing was working, what the CRTC had implemented was working, and that was just a really, really great moment for us. And so, we're back a little bit to my key points at the beginning. There are matters where sometimes deadlines are short, or you don't have the data necessary, and you have to go with principles-based advocacy. We know competition is good, we know it lowers prices, we know it gives consumers more choice. Those are great. But where it's possible, if you can say things, instead of competition leads to lower prices, you can say things like, competition is worth $1 billion extra to your economy. That's a hook, right? Everyone grabs onto that and they say, yes, I get that. My consumers, my constituents, they're going to want that. And this is just a slide to say this is consistent with principles that the OECD and the ICN have been putting forward. When you're able to quantify, when you've got that data, it's great to do so. So again, picking up on some points that were made earlier in the day by some of our other speakers, you need to devote the resources to do this. You need to make it a priority, and obviously you need the budget to do so. And we recognize that that's not going to be possible in all cases. But where possible, we find this makes the most efficient advocacy interventions. And I'll end it there so you guys can get to your coffee break, but thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you. So your presentation was very good and comprehensive. So it's not only in terms of advocacy that we can use in your experience, but also it can increase immigration flows from Ukraine to Canada when we looked at your population statistics here. So on a serious note, we have talked about several strategic markets in Ukraine: natural gas, electricity, public procurement, different international experience. But I also want to refer to a statement that was made by the director of a World Bank in Ukraine. She said that in order to increase Ukrainian GDP and continue economic growth, we need to focus on another three important reforms. And these reforms, they're connected directly and indirectly to competition. So the number one is land reform in Ukraine. Number two is the effective management of state-owned enterprises. And this will include privatization, as I understand, and then again, a principle of competition neutrality kicks in when we have SOEs and private companies, very important. And the third one is anti-corruption reform, which also has relation to competition, because if we talk about public procurement, you know, we need to tackle both in order to ensure effective development of competition. So we have very limited time. Maybe one question from the audience too, and then we break for a coffee break and come back for another session. Coffee. Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. And let's come back in 15 minutes, please. Thank you.